Vellum. It's one of those crafty products we all have in our stash, but we sometimes forget how versatile it can be. There are so many ways to use it. As a window, as a pocket, as an envelope even. You can heat emboss on it, you can dry emboss with it. I thought I would explore a different direction and try experimenting with alcohol inks and different types of stencils. I also have a couple of techniques for adhering it invisibly, including one that I had never seen before. Let's jump in. For my cards today, I'm using this heavier cardstock weight vellum that's available at most online craft stores, and I thought I would test out some of my recent alcohol ink techniques on it. For the first one, I used an old Altenew cover plate die, and I cut a stencil from the same heavy vellum. I'm going to use some Copic refills and see if I can create a background similar to last week when I used craft plastic and Yupo. I actually sprayed the back of the vellum die cut with pixie spray, and when I pressed it onto my vellum panel, it looked really pretty. I thought doubled up vellum could actually just be used like this on a card. You could get a similar look to an embossing folder or heat embossing with clear powder. But today's technique is about alcohol inks. I chose the BG70 family and I worked from light at the top down to the darkest at the bottom. And the first thing that happened was the ink got between the stencil and the panel and lifted it, which is fine. I didn't know if pixie spray would be enough to hold it down and give me really crisp results. And it isn't. The other new thing I tried today is this little Clairol hairbrush styling thingy. It has a really low air and low heat setting that is really just enough to help speed up the drying without warping the vellum, and that makes it quite useful. I went back in and I put down some more ink to fill in some of those gaps that were showing up, and I dried it some more. This is a great time to let you know that today's video is a collaboration with my friend Jerry, so you get double the ideas for using vellum in your card making. I'll put the link at the end of the video so you don't miss it. Then I removed the vellum stencil. Remember, this isn't actually a stencil, it's a piece I can use on my card. And in about 5 minutes of drying, I've got it so that the ink isn't moving anymore, which is a big improvement on having to let it dry for hours as I did in my previous videos. I've cut down the panel and it's sitting on top of my card base here. I've got it inked side up, so there's actually a bit of texture where the ink pooled, but you could also flip it over and use the other side if you wanted it to be smooth. Here's my first method for adhering vellum. We know that small bits of adhesive will show through the vellum, whether it's tape or liquid glue, or glue dots. So to me, the obvious answer is to have the adhesive showing through equally all over the vellum. To do this, I've trimmed this panel down to a square, and I've cut a piece of a double-sided adhesive sheet down to the same size. This one's from Waffle flour, but there's many out there. I put the adhesive sheet into the corner of my score buddy. A Misty would also work. You just need a corner to hold it steady. And then I put that inked vellum panel right on top. To add it to the card, I simply peeled back the release paper and positioned it. You do have to get it right. Adhesive sheets are not terribly forgiving, so I stood up to make sure I could get a good view and see that the panel was straight and centered on my card. To finish this one, I added a simple stacked up silver happy birthday die cut and some emerald gems from Crafty Meraki. The deep color and geometric shapes make this a perfect card for my hubby's birthday, which is coming up very soon. I also had the vellum stencil, don't forget, and I trimmed this down to a square as well. This time I'm going to use liquid glue to adhere it to my card, mostly because I can't add an adhesive sheet to it at this point. I could have done it before I die cut it, but I'm not sure how the adhesive sheet would have survived having all that alcohol ink thrown onto it. I put glue only in the centers where the lines of the die cut join, and then I flipped it over and put it onto my card, with an acrylic block on top to hold it in place while the glue dried. I added a simple thanks die, this time with a plain, uncolored vellum shadow layer behind it. Even though the deep color of the die cut meant that the liquid glue was not visible from the front, I added some tiny ebony pearls on those same places to add a bit of shine and dimension. This time I tried a craft plastic stencil with a vellum panel to see if it gave any different results. I used alcohol inks in yellow, red, pink, and purple this time. I'm working directly on a clean glass mat rather than my dirty box, because if the back of the vellum picks up anything from that dirty surface, like old ink or paint, it'll show through to the front. I spritzed some alcohol on top, pressed another panel of vellum on top to pick up some of the excess and to give me another colorful panel, and I let them both dry. I want to try another method of adhering the vellum to the card. This one uses the same principle of having the same adhesive spread evenly so there's no spots showing through, but this time it's with liquid glue. I saw it done here on YouTube with a makeup sponge, but I don't have one, so I used a sponge blending tool. The panel curled and the glue dried really fast, so I had to add some more and move quickly to press it down onto my card base. I added a little more glue on a couple of the corners that were lifting, and then I put blocks on it and set it aside to dry. Now here it is. You can see that the card is warped a little bit, but the panel is definitely stuck on there quite well, so this is a good alternative if you don't have an adhesive sheet, and it might work even better on a smaller piece. To finish this card, I cut a vellum circle and added some stardust stickles just around the edges. I glued a gold thanks die cut on top, and then I cut another thanks die cut from white cardstock. My idea was that if I glued the white die cut behind the gold one, it'll pop up the vellum circle and just add a bit of dimension. Once I had the liquid glue on the front of the white die cut, I quickly just laid it onto some newsprint to remove any excess glue so it won't squeeze out onto my vellum circle. I'm loving this look, and I probably could have added another white die cut for even more dimension. If you're noticing that the free edge of that circle with the glitter glue on it isn't lying perfectly flat, you are absolutely right, and we're going to talk a little bit more about that in a second. For the blended panel, I went back to a familiar layout of a large circle with a negative frame cut from it. Before I cut it though, I needed to add some adhesive to the back so I'll be able to stick it down, and I wanted to pop it up. So since I won't be able to add foam tape invisibly behind the translucent vellum, I added them both to a circle of white cardstock. I took the opportunity to twist that inner circle a bit so that the colors don't line up perfectly, and that just adds a little bit more visual interest. To finish this one, I added a navy panel behind my popped up circle after I used an Essentials for Stitching circle die to create the little negative dotted frame. I used Sentiment and Daisy die cuts from a Jillian Vance design along with some Rose Garden gems. For my third technique, I used a full sheet of that heavy vellum, and I grabbed one of my favorite stencils from Joggles called Moroccan Tile. I used 3 colors of Copic marker refills, some toned down shades of primaries, although I used mostly the yellow and the blue, with just some smaller areas of the red. Again, I used another sheet to press on top. This removes a lot of the excess ink from the stencil, plus it gives another panel that can be used, and I love the dreamy watercolor look of this one. Once it was dry, I removed the stencil and trimmed the panel down. The first piece is 1 inch by 11 inches, and I'm just going to run a bead of stickles along each edge of it and then set that aside to dry. We'll come back to it. In the meantime, I cut another piece that's 5.5 by 8.5 inches. I'm going to make a gatefold card with this panel, and I scored each end at 2 1/8 inches and then folded them in, making sure they met up and they were straight. I used the shadow of the thanks die and I placed it on the front of my card. I'll have to cut this in 2 pieces because I want half the word on each flap. So I taped the die in place and then opened the card before running it through my die cutting machine. I put the die back in place, making sure that the first half of the die is lined up with the window I've just cut, and then I repeated the process on the other side. Tape the die down, open the card, and run it through the die cutting machine. For the insert, I used the double-sided adhesive sheet, and I added that onto the back of the insert rather than onto the vellum. That's because I wanted to add some interest with a negative dot frame from the stitching die, and I didn't want there to be glue on the vellum exposed through the holes. Also, my panel is slightly smaller than the back of the card, and this will ensure that I don't have any extra glue around the insert. And now from the front, I want to add in my die cut thanks. So I closed the 2 panels and held them together with some masking tape. This will help with placement. This shadow had a long, narrow bit between the N and the K, and it seemed a bit awkward as part of the panel, so I just snipped it off with some scissors. I added liquid glue to the back of the thanks die cut and carefully pressed it onto the panel through that shadow window. Instead of a belly band, I used some gold twine tied in a bow to hold it shut. And speaking of belly bands, or should I say belly bands, I've created a 4 1/4 inch square gatefold card. So simple. Just plain white cardstock with some of those stickles along the 2 edges. I've taken a scrap of the vellum and added a piece of adhesive sheet behind it, and I'll put that along one side of the interior of the card just for some interest because this card is looking pretty plain right now. But here's that long strip I added the stickles to. When you add glitter glue to the edge of vellum, it kind of crinkles up and it doesn't lie flat, but we can take advantage of that property and use it to add dimension and interest. I taped the card shut, This will make it easier to measure the valley band by just placing it around the card, making sure it's straight and checking with the grid on my work surface, and then pressing hard on those edges to get a good crease. I had a little piece of double-sided tape to the back, and I trimmed off the excess, and then I tested it. It wouldn't move. I had pressed down those creases a little too hard and glued it a little too tight. I was able to lift the end and replace it a little less tight, and then my band was able to slip on and off the card. I added a stacked up gold thanks die cut to finish this one off.
Now that was so awesome! Didn't you love the techniques and those gorgeous cards? Ardit always has the best ideas. Now, if you're up for it, you can come check out some more techniques at my channel. You can find my video somewhere around here and in the description box below this video. And as Ardit always says, thanks so much for watching. See you next time.